PowerNomics Chapter 1. Racism, Monopolies, and Inappropriate Behavior. Alice, which road do I take? Chestercat, where do you want to go? Alice, I don't know. Chester, then it doesn't matter which road you take. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. The challenges we face, as the Cheshire Cat said to Alice, who was lost in a wonderland fantasy. It doesn't matter much which road you take if you don't know where you're going. It is time for Black Americans to take a good hard look at where they have come from and where they are going. And are they moving forward or standing still? After centuries of participating in protests, marches, race riots, and demonstrations, and pushing for integration and passage of an endless number of civil rights laws, Black Americans are increasingly sensing that something is wrong. They question whether or not they are on the right road. A comparative analysis of our socio-economic conditions shows that Black Americans have entered the new millennium much the same way as they entered the previous 4 centuries, as an impoverished, powerless, and neglected people. Since there have yet to be any programs and public policies specifically offered to eliminate the plight of Black masses, their future, like their past, looks bleak. Amid a rising tide of white conservatism, the wealth and income gaps between majority white society and Blacks are widening. Nearly a half a century after the Supreme Court ordered racial desegregation, Black Americans still bear 6 to 8 times their proportional share of poverty, broken homes, homelessness, criminal incarceration, unemployment, and other social pathologies. Desegregation should have been about redistribution, wealth, power, and resources, not social integration. Social integration has only addressed the symptoms of our dilemma rather than the causes. As indicated in Figure 1, it is extremely difficult for Black people to progress when the same hands that held the whips still holds almost all of the power and wealth. Figure 1. Same overclass, same underclass. During centuries of Black enslavement and Jim Crow semi-slavery, the majority society secured and retained its inherited advantages, while a Black majority inherited a legacy of disadvantage in their race-based society. Whites acquired ownership and control of nearly everything of value, as well as a system for keeping Blacks non-competitive and powerless. The sheer existence and size of a growing Black underclass is prima facie evidence of institutionalized racism that manipulates symbols, resources, and power to advantage whites over Blacks. The reality of Black America's dilemma is that they are predestined to become a permanent underclass if they do not break free of the numerous disadvantages they have inherited. Blacks should get off their social road to nowhere. There are no yellow brick roads to the future, nor will blacks simply stumble into wealth and power in a competitive society. To find a better road requires blacks to unlearn old behavior models, strategies, and learned helplessness in race matters. Blacks must understand the nature of the competitive race and make a radical metamorphosis that must decide where they want to go. Get out front of their competitors and work hard to get there first. If blacks compete, they can expect to succeed and survive in the race for wealth and power. Race and racism and wealth. Although slavery and Jim Crow semi-slavery ended generations ago, their legacies live on in various forms of structural racism. Contrary to popular notion about the concept of race, it is more than a biological grouping. Race is about financial, political, social currencies. It is a form of stored wealth and power. Whiteness has monetary value. Knowing the origin and nature of the value of race is essential to any analysis of Black America's dilemma. It is important that blacks know why the race problem refuses to die and how it is used to keep them a non-competitive and powerless group. The word race first appeared with the emergence of slave practice in the 16th century. Records indicate the word race was selected because the various European slave trading nations were in a contest competing to profit from minerals and human wealth of Africa. The prize for winning the race was the power to develop Western civilization using the wealth extracted out of Africa. Black people were non-competitive in the race. They were the prize, so they could neither play nor win. All the competing slave trading nations, religions, and ethnic groups benefited and were advantaged by black slavery. Slavery is most often approached in social and moral terms. It is seldom discussed in terms of the primary incentive that undergird the slave trade, wealth building. Slavery must always be explained in monetary terms. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, organized religion used doctrines to justify slave trading. During this period, botanists and others in the biological science were studying and attempting to stratify plants and animals based upon their biological similarities and differences. They ordered plants and animals by species. Though it took nearly 300 years, the concept of race eventually merged with the concept of biological species. By the time white Europeans had secured nearly total control of the world's superiority on the basis of who controlled the wealth, power, and resources at that particular time in history. Wealth, power, and privileges became prerogatives of non-blacks. Through intellectual sleight of hand, race became synonymous with the terms species in the mid-1800s. At that time, Charles Darwin developed the concept of biological race. In The Origin of Species, it has quickly become popular, often called survival of the fittest. Darwin's theories, as well as a number of other quasi-scientific concepts, were used by educators, politicians, and religious leaders to justify black slavery and establish a qualitative ranking of inherited genes in human fitness. Naturally, those controlling the wealth and power put their cultural values and biological characteristics at the top of the racial order, and blacks at the bottom, beneath Caucasians and Mongols, Asians. All the major European religious denominations at the time used the Bible to teach racial ranking with explicit black inferiority. During the black civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, the concept of biological races was intentionally expanded to include cultural, religion, and ethnics and Spanish-speaking languages groups, which were competing with black people for rights, space, and privileges. The concept of race was then diluted and attitudinal level to an attitudinal level, and the term of racism was used to interchangeably with such terms as bias, prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination. Now the term racism has become so amorphous that it has little meaning and is applied to all so-called minorities. If black Americans are to resolve and reverse the legacies of slavery, they must view and treat racism based upon its original meaning and intent. Racism, a race without a finish line. Racism is a wealth and power-based competitive relationship between blacks and non-blacks. The sole purpose of racism is to support and ensure that the white majority and its ethnic subgroups continue to dominate and use blacks as a means to produce wealth and power. Centuries of blacks enslaved in Jim Crow semi-slavery resulted in the majority society becoming 99-foot giants and blacks 1-foot midgets. This massive inequity in wealth and resources made blacks non-competitive and totally dependent upon whites for the necessities of life. True racism exists only when one group holds disproportionate shares of wealth and power over another group, then uses those resources to marginalize, exploit, exclude, and subordinate the weaker group. In America, it is whites who use wealth and power to marginalize and exploit and subordinate blacks. Whites can deny blacks employment, education opportunities, business resources, a place to live, or right to vote. Therefore, according to this definition, black people cannot be racist. No group of blacks has the power or exclusive control of resources to the degree that can educationally, politically, and economically and socially exploit and marginalize the white race. Blacks can only react to racism and try to alter the conditions that racism creates. Despite realities, there are numerous conservative blacks who act as apologists for white racism and confuse the issue. A conservative black radio talk show host in Los Angeles, for example, charges that blacks are as racist as whites. His desire for white approval was as well as his ignorance of history impedes him from understanding that White racism and black prejudice are just not the same thing. Blacks have a reason for their feelings about whites based on how they have been treated by whites. The white race, on the other hand, has never been marginalized by black race. Racism reinforces the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow semi-slavery. Blacks have been unable to escape from those legacies because of the majority society acknowledge the operation of racism in the distant past, but minimizes its present significance. The burdens of inequality. The concept of race has progressed from international competition for wealth and power to religion, doctrine, to biological classification, to a personal attitude. Yet, conditions and opportunities are unequal between competing minority groups. There has been no equal sharing of burdens in our equal opportunity society. Members of ethnic class, gender, disabled, religious, Spanish language, and sexual orientation groups have not been treated in a manner equal to blacks. This nation has never enacted and supported public policies and laws that have denied non-blacks access to the nation's education, political, and social economic systems. These groups have not been customarily lynched, castrated, exploited, and denied the fruits of their labor. Blacks are the only group of people forced to practice capitalism without capital in the richest and most capitalistic nation on earth. These facts, coupled with majority society total unwillingness to approve corrective action and reparations for descendants of black slaves, reveal the true nation of racism against black people. Racism and other legacies of slavery predetermine the success of black Americans as a group. One of the most glaring examples of inherited inequities is wealth discrimination. Black Americans' percentage of ownership of the nation's wealth remained where it was in the 1860s, on the eve of the Civil War. At that time, when nearly every black person in America was either in full slavery or semi-slavery, blacks owned 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth. The emancipation of enslaved blacks is nonsense, rendered social justice and economic recompense. Today, more than 140 years later, we are 100% free, yet black Americans still own only 1/2 of a 1% of the nation's wealth. Today, the income of blacks are, as compared to whites, has regressed in the level it was at the end of the 1960s. Approximately 38% of the black population is beneath the poverty line, and another 1/3 is marginal, just above the poverty line. The limited assets that black Americans most often have, such as automobiles and personal effects, depreciate rather than appreciate in value. Blacks even find that our homes, usually our most valuable assets, have a limited market and prices dictated by urban renewal, expressways, and gentrification. The average black person passes 0 assets to future generations. The typical white family is more economically stable and secure. approximately 87% of this nation's economic assets are now frozen within the dominant white society and are passed on from one generation to the next in such forms as stocks, bonds, land, businesses, trusts, accounts, endowment, foundations, and insurance policies. Therefore, white children are privileged to enter the world with 87% of the resources that they need to succeed in life already in their families, race, communities, businesses, schools, government, or social organization. Thus, succeeding generations of whites can access these wealth resources over and over again. What is wealth? Wealth is referred to as wealth refers to the net value of a person, group, or community, less their liabilities or debt at a given point in time. It is stored value. Income, in contrast, refers to a flow of dollars over a period of time. With rare exceptions, most blacks are so marginalized that they own and control little wealth or resources anywhere, including their own neighborhoods. The ancestors of enslaved blacks were forced to concentrate simply on surviving, pursuing civil rights and integration. They had little social and civil rights efforts. Their children cannot inherit wealth, food stamps, public housing, or a good job. 3 major impediments of blacks' competitiveness. Regardless of how fast or how black Americans jump without proportion wealth, ownership, and control of resources, it is nearly impossible for blacks to play the game of capitalism, even most difficult for them to win. Why can't blacks win? Let's examine 3 major impediments to black self-sufficiency and competitiveness. Figure 2 shows that the 3 major impediments are maldistribution of wealth and resources power, inappropriate behavior patterns, lack of national plan for empowerment. Each of these 3 major impediments is carefully examined and discussed in detail in the next few sections of the book. No national economic and political empowerment plan, inappropriate psychosocial behavior patterns, maldistribution of wealth and resources powers. Impediments of black self-sufficiency and competitiveness. The first impediment, maldistribution of wealth. The first impediment of black empowerment is the structural wealth inequities between blacks and whites. To begin our journey to self-empowerment, we must first understand that these inequities are structural, much like the framing of a house. The frame provides the underlying support for the walls, ceilings, and floors. You cannot see the framing once the walls and floorings have been completed. As long as the house stands, the way in which the house was framed will dictate not only its shape, but also the mobility of the people who live in the house. The structural racism, inequities of wealth and resources, powers, functions in the similar way. They are buried in the fabric of America's society. They dictate life changes, rewards, and opportunities, and explain how people act in race matters. Whites have had such total control over wealth, power, and resources, and basic necessities of life that it has become the norm. Racial myths have long promoted the belief that the conditions of black Americans are the consequence of nature rather than the result of the nation's historic acts. The Structural inequities of race can only persist if the historical origin of white control of wealth, resources, and power remain either unknown or ignored. White society will not publicly admit its powerful self-interest perpetuates the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow's semi-slavery. The critical contributions of black people to the development of the nation and the Western civilization are largely hidden. To admit black people's contributions is to trigger white guilt and a sense of responsibility for black people's predicament. According to records, the majority society compiled its wealth by using a simple economic principle. The industry of slavery produced a 1,500% return on investment without the burden of wages, employment benefits, and taxes. The lifetime profit produced by slaves were passed on to the slaveholders' heirs and their heirs' heirs. Wealth accumulated for white society while poverty accumulated for blacks. Our nation claims to be an equal opportunity colorblind society after more than a century of distributing the nation's land and wealth producing resources to everyone but blacks. Even after Jim Crow's segregation ended in the 1960s and this nation formally became a just society, the white society committed only $15 billion to conduct a war on poverty. Since this program included every group in America, it is unclear how this limited effort was supposed to correct the centuries of abuse inflicted specifically on black people. Social conservatives argue that 7 years of the Great Society programs fulfilled all responsibilities that white society had to blacks for 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow semi-slavery. Neither the United States nor social conservatives have offered a public explanation for including gender, ethnic, class, Spanish-speaking, and disabled groups in a program that supposedly paid the nation's debt to blacks. Ironically, during the same 7-year period, this nation spent $120 billion on the war in Vietnam, which was 8 times larger than the amount spent on the war of poverty. Hidden behind the facade of a colorblind society, racism in the 1970s became politically incorrect. To maintain the status quo, structural racism replaced over racism and term minorities replaced blacks. Our monopolized society. Racism in America has gone through a number of mutations, though already retaining its inequities. It is now practically impossible for members of our society to see and prove racism against black people. It is now hidden behind pseudo-egalitarian smokescreen. Social conservatives and the political elite praised Martin Luther King Jr., picked up the rhetoric of black civil rights movement, but distorted the fundamental intent of the movement. They proclaimed that racial inequity is no longer existed and all groups were starting out even. Thus, they created an illusion, just like the drunk who took his pet alligator into a bar, cut off his tail and painted it yellow and called it a dog. Social conservatives and the power elite are taking racism through similar false transformations. However, no matter how it is camouflaged, racism is still right before our eyes. Old-fashioned racism has gone legitimate again, masquerading with all of the rights and privileges of approved monopolies. The word monopoly emanates from the word monarch. According to Charles R. Gist, the author of Monopolies in America, the tradition of monopolies was inherited from English common law. The British granted patent letters to merchants, giving them exclusive rights to provide certain goods and services. Any monopoly conveying the ultimate source of power, wealth, and control to a person, group, or business. When a business entity has a monopoly, it dominates and controls nearly all aspects of an industry and can use its massive power to raise barriers to control markets and bankrupt competitors. A racial monopoly, like any other monopoly, is defined by its origin and the power it has over competitors. On its way to becoming the essence of various white monopolies, racism has passed through three monopolistic stages. The first stage is natural monopoly. That protects things that are strategically vital to the government itself. In race matters, whiteness and all of its ramifications was always strategically vital and invaluable, entitled, and its barrier to wealth, privileges, authorities, and power, and certain inalienable rights. The United States Constitution codified whiteness as a national asset. Various states and local governments passed anti-miscegenation laws that defined whiteness and protected it from the race mixing. The second is collusive monopoly. This monopoly exists when members of a tightly knit group of public agencies or private corporations entered into specific agreements to control marketplace or the wealth, power, and resources of a society over their common competitors. In race matters, it is a collusive monopoly when this nation continuously expands the definition of whiteness to include a hierarchy of ethnic groups. Today, it includes succession of immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, Spanish-speaking countries, and Asia. All of these groups are unified as a group of Caucasian race, with the exception of blacks and Asians. According to Andrew Hacker, Asians are on probation to be classified as whites. Immigration laws are examples of specific agreements that control marketplace, wealth, and power. These laws establish new priorities for admissions, country of origin, family members who are already here, possession of needed skills, and financial ability to purchase entry. This criteria is biased toward immigrants with skin color that is more acceptable than black. The third stage is a shared monopoly. This is a popular term used in the business world today. A shared monopoly is a composite of collusive and natural monopoly. It reaches its maximum effectiveness when members of a group work together to control or drive competition out of the marketplace. Small businesses have federal monopolies, but there are no constitutional or government provisions that prevent the white society and its feeder immigrants group from shutting blacks out of political and economic marketplaces. A brief history of monopoly building in America. Over the course of this nation's history, there has been at least three major phases of monopoly building for wealth and power. The first monopoly building phase in American history occurred during the colonization of America, when Europeans in general and English particular formed and held natural monopolies in land, exerted the power of its newly found slave-based wealth institution, the Navigation Act of 1760, and other laws and tariffs that mandated that Americans colonist ships their slave produced raw products and goods to England for processing, manufacturing, and marketing. The colonists then had to purchase back the finished product at a higher inflated price. This system effectively allowed England to exercise full economic and political control and to economically exploit its colonies as well. As other nations. England became the king of slave trading and held a natural monopoly on constructing slave-based economics. The English crown established the first franchising system that built plantations, financed the slaveholders, supplied the slaves and ships, and processed the slave product goods. It took a full century for the American colonists to recognize that they were locked into an English monopoly. Once the reality set in, they began calling those monopolies tyrannies. The American colonies rejected England's plans to expropriate the fruits of slave labor and to control the policies of the colonies. The colonists knew from the English history of serfdom that any system that politically subordinates, economically exploits, and socially dominates a group of people is tyranny because it reduces them to slaves. The colonists did not want to be England's serfs. They preferred to fight when they ignited and fought the Revolutionary War for their independence. The second phase of monopoly building began shortly after the Revolutionary War. The American colonists immediately drafted the United States Constitution, which imposed on black people the same government-sponsored tyranny, and that colonists rejected under the English rule. The founding fathers of this nation, most of whom were slaveholders, and they're sympathetic to other slaveholders, drafted and ratified the United States Constitution. That document gave the controls that England had over colonists before the war. Just as a slave labor had made England wealthy, it allowed Southern slaveholders to operate in their own best interest rather than the best interest of the Northern whites or enslaved blacks. The North eventually concluded that it could not acquire competitive wealth and power until it broke the South's monopoly on black labor. In 1861, the Civil War broke out between North and South over wealth and political power. The third phase of monopoly building occurred after the North won the Civil War. The war effectively destroyed legalized slavery and transferred the South's monopolies on wealth and political powers to the North. The North focused its newly acquired wealth and power on industrializing the North and the West. The massive amounts of money previously invested in slavery industry and the Civil War military production was used to build bridges, canals, railroads, ships, and factories. However, in achieving the political economic defeat of the South, the North had ignored the 5 million ex-slaves. Major political organizations in the North went on recording opposing emancipation of enslaved blacks unless they were shipped out of the country in order that they not compete against white men's labor. Stephen Steinberg wrote, "The North abandoned black ex-slaves. The South got the message and commandeered blacks into semi-slavery while the North looked the other way." According to a memorandum of proceedings in the United States Senate, the Southern states, by their situation and climate, require black labor and must have it, or the states will cease to have any value. The Southern states enacted black codes that again gave them a shared monopoly control on land, economic systems and governments, education systems, and black laborers for 100 years. Both the North and the South used various levels of government to create white-only business, political, intellectual, and social monopolies. These advantages of property, technology, and political participation and major businesses opportunities were passed on to succeeding generations of white males. Racial monopolies in America. Racial monopolies predetermine winners and losers and are considered a normal part of our political economic structure. Through these monopolies, white society maintains a lock on the central element of black people's lives and makes black people spectators in the democratic process. The racial monopolies discussed below are but a few of nearly invisible structures that marginalize and justify black America's position as this nation's permanent minority loser. Racial monopolies in America. Racial monopolies determine winners and losers and are considered a normal part of our political economic structure. Through these monopolies, white society maintains a look on essential elements of black people's lives and make black people spectators in the democratic process. The racial monopolies discussed below are built a few of the nearly invisible structures that marginalize and justify black America's position as this nation's permanently minority losers. Monopolies established in the Constitution. As indicated earlier, the United States Constitution is not and has never been colorblind. It is race-specific and color-conscious. For all intents and purposes, the Constitution remains unchanged. The founders and founding fathers were the first ones to play the race card. In fact, they were the original card dealers. They allocated rights, resources, and power to the majority white society. America essentially has two constitutions, one for whites and one for blacks. Constitutional amendments 1 through 12 are race-specific, empower the majority white society. The 13 through 15 amendments was also color-specific. They gave citizenship and empowerment rights to blacks and ex-slaves. The 13th Amendment eliminates legal slavery. The 14th Amendment gave blacks equal protection and due process rights. The 15th Amendment extended voting and other social rights to blacks. Majority social society has co-opted these amendments. During Reconstruction in the 1860s, major social and economic forces began to make these amendments colorblind, even though they were originally specific to blacks. The term colorblind was not formally used until 1896 when Chief Justice John M. Harlan of the Supreme Court issued a dissenting opinion of the Peaslee versus Ferguson decision. The Supreme Court held that there was nothing wrong with separate but equal accommodations for blacks and whites as a public policy. But Justice Harlan said the Constitution was colorblind. He was the first to say it, but he was wrong. The Constitution has always been color specific. The color consciousness of the Constitution was no accident. The Constitution codified the racial inequalities that exist initially in our society. James Madison, a major author of the Constitution and slaveholder, knew he was not including black people when he spoke on how the country would always be divided between those who held property and those who were themselves property. When he spoke of owning property, he meant items such as household furnishings, livestock, and land. He also clearly included ownership of slaves. When the Constitution was finally ratified in 1789, however, it used broad, ambiguous, and offensive public relation type words such as all and everyone, rather than to refer directly to black slaves. Still, it established a system in which the racial group defined as white could hold monopolies of wealth and power over the subordinate black group that was classified as personal property and only 2/3 of a human. The Constitution also included an affirmative action provision for the South that eventually led to the Civil War between the North and the South. The Constitution made white Southerners a protected minority with the privilege of holding a monopoly on slavery. More specifically, a provision in the U.S. Constitution gave the Southern minority political rights, peripheral treatment in the Fugitive Slave Act, favorable quotas on the export and import slave-related products, and set aside advantages on elected representation in Congress. This revered document declared freedom and justice for everyone but blacks, while giving special status, privilege, and rights to the South. The Constitution continues to be used as the basis to deny preferences, affirmative action, and reparations for black Americans. Citizenship and the benefit of whiteness was constitutionally denied to blacks. Ironically, like blacks, Indians were also specifically identified in the Constitution, but they were excluded from official abuse because they were categorized as free, inhabitant, and encouraged to assimilate into white society. By the end of the 19th century, American Indians had the option to leave the reservations or maintain protected wards of the government. Yet, throughout their relationship, white leaders and various institutions have recognized Indians as acceptable extension of white society that ranked higher in the biological order than blacks. When the U.S. Constitution was modified in 1860s, through the addition of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the Black Constitution, after numerous rewrites, the final language contained ambiguous words such as all persons, any person, and everyone, although it was commonly understood that the Constitution amendments were for blacks ex-slaves. The initial congressional enabling language hinted that these civil rights laws bound the U.S. Congress to take care of black ex-slaves until they could take care of themselves. To this day, however, Congress has never abided by their own laws in this regard, and members have sat by silently while the dominant society has boldly undermined the economic rights awarded to black people. They allowed the majority white society to co-opt the Black Constitution and promote the myth that the United States was colorblind. The Constitution was conceived as a social economic covenant for those who already had power, wealth, and nearly unlimited rights. To be truly democratic society, this nation would have to redistribute and share some of its wealth and power with Black America. The Black Constitution was passed following the Civil War because of the efforts of a small group of radical, liberal, Republican congressmen who succeeded in amending the Constitution by excluding color-specific amendments of blacks. These amendments gave blacks a minimum level of rights that certain congressmen hoped would offset some of the tyranny of the white majority society. Population monopolies. One of the first acts of the U.S. Congress following the ratification of the Constitution was to enact of this nation's first naturalized and immigration laws in the 1790s. This law declared America to be a white nation and a zero quota on black immigrants, except as slaves. A quota of approximately zero remained in effect until 1965, when it was increased to its current level of 0.5%. Throughout most of the nation's history, people of African descent have been nearly shut out of immigration and refugee programs of the United States. Blacks have competed in the nation's majority wins population game almost exclusively from birth rates rather than immigration. Though they could never win as a national majority, they also have never won as a local majority. The Black Civil Rights Movement quest for integration ensured that blacks would always be a minority population in white schools, businesses, jobs, communities, and or entertainment centers. The census is conducted every decade and established that official population count of the country. Efforts to create a multicultural category in the 2000 census will most likely dilute and in reality distort downward the number of blacks in America. Dilution of population numbers assures that blacks will lose status as the numerical majority minority. Government efforts to change racial definitions will retain the white popular majority monopoly and inflate the numbers of Hispanics in the population. In this book, Uprooting Racism, Paul Keeble, whiteness is a many-faceted phenomenon, slowly and constantly shifting its emphasis all the time, maintaining a racial hierarchy and protecting the power that occurs to white people. Although there are no natural or essential qualities or characteristics of whiteness or of white people, it is not only fiction to let go of. By constantly enlarging the ethnic boundaries of whiteness, all Europeans, Middle Easterners, Hispanics, and soon Asians, white separate people are entitled to privilege and wealth from people who are exploited and violated. In a group-based society, constant efforts to enlarge the majority white population ensures that a shared racial population monopoly will continue to exist far into the future. The 2000 census form offers blacks 54 subcategories to opt out of their race and future optimize their population numbers. The census will not dilute whiteness. On the contrary, it further expands the definition of whiteness. Let's look at how a shared white monopoly impacts Black America's life changes. Whites are planned majority. Blacks, on the other hand, are planned permanently minority. Limited by immigration policies, blacks are only 12.4% of the general population. They are outnumbered 7-1 by a shared white majority, that is 87% of the population. This means that whites can override blacks at least 7 times, making it impossible for blacks to take over anything. Moreover, with the exception of entertainment, blacks do not exceed 1% of ownership, control, or representation of anything positive in America, and critical skills professions such as doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, scientists, judges, physicists, business owners, wealth holders, and effective office officials. Blacks never exceeded 1/2 of the 1%. If every black professional was hired in public sector or private sector jobs, whites would still hold approximately 99.5% of the professional positions. If all of the 36 million black people in the entire country were employed, the educated, the uneducated, senior citizens, those in prison, children, infants, teenagers, and their total numbers could never exceed 12% of the workforce. When blacks try to even marginally increase their percentage in the workforce, whites are threatened and initiate a backlash. Wealth monopolies. Slavery and Jim Crow semi-slavery did not just make whites a little bit richer than blacks. Whites are vastly richer. They have deprived blacks people of nearly the whole economic pie. It is the proportion of that pie that a group owns that determines its access to functional schools, competitive businesses, educational justice, essential health care, personal comfort, and the length of quality of their lives. The nature of white wealth has cut blacks off from nearly all of their fundamentals of life. White society not only owns or controls most of the nation's wealth and power resources, but most of it's passed on from our generation of whites to the next. This is one reason why there is a low proportion of whites who are poor compared to a number of poor blacks, and why the children of affluent white parents are less likely than blacks to ever become poor. Wealth is frozen and stored inside the white race. It is in the families, cultures, businesses, forms of stocks, bonds, land, insurance policies, trust accounts, and foundations. It is inconceivable that blacks could cross racial boundaries and successfully displace these frozen forms of wealth. As indicated in Table 1, whites only nearly 100% whites own nearly 100% of all corporate bonds and stocks, which amount to approximately 13 trillion. In 1986, the 256th largest company of the Fortune 500, a white corporation, had sales equal to 16 billion. Total combined sales of the nation's 100 largest black-owned businesses, as listed in the August 2000 edition of Black Enterprise magazine. While the wealth gap continues to widen between blacks and whites, the numbers and millionaires and billionaires increase. During the 1980s, for example, the number of millionaires and billionaires also increased by 300 and 500%, respectively. Although a handful of black entertainers, and most often a result of increased income, which is not the same as increased wealth. However, none of the wealthiest black entertainers and athletes appear on the Forbes list of the wealthiest 500. White wealth ownership compared to black wealth ownership. Blacks 268,568, whites 8,863,999. Percent of greater than blacks 3,300. Financial, stocks, rental properties. Obtaining wealth equally in America is a rigged game. There is no equal opportunity to gain wealth. Such opportunities typically depends on 4 factors: inborn capacity, cultural and educational opportunities, ownership and control of resources, the power of racism. In summary, this means a white person of normal talent who lives in an enriched culture with parents who can afford the best has excellent chance to become rich and live well. Economic Darwinism tracks both parental and racial bloodlines. Structural racism enables rights to acquire wealth, while capitalism gains and inheritance laws ensure they will keep the control of wealth. Steve Bauer stated in his book Sharing the Pie in that 1996 Charles Darrance of the 9 million shares of company stocks and earned $740 million. Warren Buffett, a Wall Street investor, profited $10.6 billion over a period of 24 months for a total fortune of $21 billion. In comparison, nearly 50% of Black America has a net worth approximating zero because its debt negates any property or assets that can pass on to their offspring. The white economic stronghold on essential empowerment resources is also reflected in business ownership and management, which is nearly 100% white and mostly male. When white economic monopolies open up, white females get in the door first, followed by the economic minority classified as white. As Brower writes, white men are in no danger of losing or even sharing control of management of the nation's top 500 corporations. For at least 25 years, America's top 104 corporations have an average of one black in senior position. Media monopolies. Commercial media create a virtual reality of our society. Not only are the owners of the media responsible for the information that we see and hear, but they create images of blacks and define us in our sense of community. This is truesome for blacks because whites hold ownership monopolies over the nation's print and electronic media. Media ownership is a source of control over power, wealth, and information. Media power is political power. Whites control nearly 100% of the nation's 1,500 daily newspapers, 11,000 radio stations, and 11,800 cable systems, 1,500 television stations, and the major internet businesses. These monopolies ensure that blacks will never have effective mass communication systems of their own. It means that blacks will always have to ask permission to use white-owned mass media vehicles to reach out to other blacks as discuss sensitive racial issues. Members of the public who desire to be exposed to perspective of blacks are deprived of that information and do not access to that typical unfiltered programming. White society constructs monopolies inside of monopolies. Clear channels communication provide a good example of media ownership. As an example, radical monopolies that is also a major source of wealth and power. According to the company's 1999 annual report, it owns 900 radio stations, 19 television stations, and 700,000 outdoor advertising units in the United States. It has equity interest in 240 radio stations, and internally, the company gross revenue in 1999 was $3 billion, which was 97% from the 1998. White media protects white interests. Without wealth to own media outlets, blacks will always be in the position of complaining about images other than present of them. But they will never have significant means to change on fashion appropriate images of themselves. In 1999, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, led a complaint and a threatened a boycott against all the networks for a television season that lacked minority characters in the program lineup. The network owners did not forget that blacks existed. They chose not to include them. In fact, in matters like this, blacks negotiate from a position of weakness because they own no networks and few television stations. In the case of the complaint, the NAACP would have come closer to addressing a core black problem if it had challenged the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the executive branch of government to demand greater black ownership of television outlets. Without ownership, blacks are unable to communicate with their own people without passing through and having the approval of non-black media owners. And since blacks issues tend to make whites feel guilty or threatened, white media only gives black access to their media when the issues are racial, neutral, or relevant to the majority society. Even when blacks own media, they have impediments to programming or economic success. The few broadcast and print properties that are black-owned are so dependent upon white advertisers for revenue that programming from a black perspective is also often muted to avoid disapproval as to black. Anything that is all black is too black. There are not enough black advertisers to support black media companies which are afterthought with white advertisers. If they do not elect to purchase advertising from black-owned media outlets, it will be safe programming. They avoid supporting black media when it reflects racial controversy. No other group has social prohibitions. Nearly 99% of all white Americans live in all white communities, work in all white offices, conduct businesses with white customers, and send their children to all white schools. White print and broadcast media outlets target nearly 100% white audiences, but they are not criticized for being too white. Even national political parties spend less with black media than they spend to reach each other's groups. According to the May 18th to May 24th, 2000 issue of the Challenger magazine, the Republican National Committee indicated it would spend $10 million in advertising with Hispanic media and $0 with black media in its 2000 presidential campaign. As late as 2 months before the polls opened, unofficial reports indicates that the National Democratic Party had yet to commit money to black media. White media monopolies go unchallenged regardless of how frequently and unjustly black people are treated. The control of images we see by the media and the corporations about who buy advertisements was demonstrated in Detroit, Michigan at the premiere showing of the Tulsa Oklahoma massacre. The Hidden Story in spring 2000. The movie produced for home box office tells the story of the 1921 racial assault that claimed lives of approximately 600 blacks. Their homes, businesses were robbed, bombed, and burned by whites who admitted in the program that they were jealous of black people's economic success. Although this film is a poignant and important historical documentary, white businesses in Detroit area refused to financially support its airing on the Wayne State University campus. Government resources has always been used to develop and maintain a majority monopolies. Government policies allow media and communication monopolies such as the telephone and broadcast industries. The internet, developed large with government funds, is now owned by private companies and is becoming another white-owned media monopoly. Political and judicial monopolies. The nation's political and judicial systems are racial monopolies that form the superstructure of society. Those monopolies make nearly every political and legal issue about race a foregone conclusion. Politics and the court tend to be more anti-black than the larger society. Legal justice has come to mean ensuring that blacks do not break the law while forcing them to cheerfully submit to whites breaking the law. Though their population monopolies ensure that whites will always dominate and rule, racism within the political and legal systems guarantee blacks will rarely win. Thurgood Marshall, by his acts and omissions, was probably the only U.S. Supreme Court justice prejudiced in favor of black people, however, outnumbered 8-1. His legal opinions had little real impact on race rulings. Conversely, Marshall's replacement on the U.S. Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, seems most concerned about his acceptance by white society. In fairness, Clarence Thomas, even if he were to begin acting as a responsible black man, his vote would not change the way the U.S. Supreme Court works and rules. He too is outnumbered. Several justices were appointed when there were two litmus tests for any appointment to the Supreme Court: credible conservative views and willingness to avoid using the court to correct historical injustices, especially through committed against blacks. Michael Lynn, in his book Up from Conservatism, shares a story that illustrates how bias against black is institutionalized in the judicial monopoly. Lynn says William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was ordered away from a polling place in Arizona in 1950 because he was demanding that blacks voters be forced to prove that they could read by reading the Constitution before beginning allowed to mark their ballots. Rehnquist passed the litmus test of President Reagan, who appointed him, along with his racial attitudes, Chief Justice of the highest court in the nation. In this position, his racial bias could affect court decisions throughout the nation. Any counter bias for blacks was nullified through Thomas' appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Consequently, judicial monopolies control the fate of blacks in ways that are rarely beneficial. Research supports this premises. As late as the 1900s, nearly 60% of whites, Hispanics, and Asian Americans constitute to receive black people as inferior, undeserving of justice, and innately criminal. Justice for blacks in a system that reflects such bias and indifference is virtually impossible. Whites maintain a monopoly on holding political offices, whether black or not. For example, increases black voter registration and participation resulted in 9,000% increase in the number of blacks elected officials within the last 2 generations. Yet, black public office holders still represent less than 1% of the nation's elected officials. The political and judicial systems are cornerstone institutions that whites monopolize, even as most people espouse believe in the colorblind myth. A monopoly on the effect and appointment process for public office will continue to place white males in control of 99% of all levels of government and legal systems. Whites in position of American society to protect the status quo and the advantage of their own group self-interest. They instinctively reflect the more of structural racism in the normal course of behaving. The majority of whites who hold high positions in the political and judicial systems are descendants of white immigrants who entered this nation centuries after the ancestors of black Americans, though their ancestors were not in this country when blacks were enslaved and segregated. Special admission status reserved seats of power for them in judicial and political systems. The nation's fundamental democratic values of inalienable rights and principles of fair play have yet to apply fully to blacks. There is, and its monopolies are concerned about the negative impact of them on the life changes of blacks. Whiteness as a monopoly is a subconscious construct that promotes aversion to any form of blackness, specifically, especially within the political legal system. Whites tend to equate blackness to liberalism, which has the effect of moving all the equate blackness to liberalism, which has the effect of moving all the nation's political parties to racial selfishness. They stack the law enforcement and court systems with conservative officers and judges who are predisposed to anti-black feelings. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which was enacted solely for equal protection of blacks, is co-opted and used by political systems to maintain white dominance. By the virtue of black people's inherited disadvantage and whites' inherited life advantages, the races are locked into conflict and competition. These racial conflicts, and occupying racial disparities cannot be eliminated by indifference or black leaders. Accommodations. When black leaders accommodate and compromise, they lose respect, and the black masses move no closer to the corridors of power and wealth. Moreover, whites find it easier to pacify blacks with symbolic rather than substantive political benefits and opportunities. This only further reinforces racial inequities. The implication of monopolies. The advantages that flow of white society from various monopolies. The vision manifestations of racism has yet to be weighed and analyzed to determine how they handicap and ensure Black America in a competitive society. Whites monopolies guarantee white winners as if ordained by the gods. Few see the social dominance as a persistent and fundamental injustice within America society. Racial monopolies adversely affect the wealth of blacks and further the best interest of the majority society. Within any marketplace, the majority social forces black competitors out of existence. The country's founders created a flawed social and political structure that only began to take on the appearance of social democracy through the pain and suffering of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and a Black Civil Rights Movement. These national events were more symbolic rather than substantive for blacks, and now the likelihood of ever catching up with the majority white population is extremely remote. Blacks suffer too many wealth and resource power deficiencies after nearly 4 centuries of trying to climb a greased pole. Many blacks have given up hope of ever closing the inequality gaps. Structural racism and its monopolies have boxed and locked black people, but nothing created or constructed by mankind is perfect, including structural racism and racial monopolies. Myths of a colorblind, racial neutral society support racial monopolies. Public policies or programs that claim to be race neutral or colorblind will not help Black Americans, but support that status quo and prevailing inequalities. The dominant society uses its accumulated advantages to foster and promote even greater advantages for its members. However, with proper planning and preparation, Black America can compete, in some instances, beat a monopoly. Let's look at 3 possible options that an oppressed group might use against the tyranny of majority monopoly. The oppressed group can revolt and engage in civil disobedience that bring about political and economic reform of entirely new government, petition government to intervene on its behalf, and force white monopoly to divest itself of some wealth, resources, and power. And 3, construct alternative political and economical systems and monopolies based on its own group advantages within its own communities. The suggestions in this book includes all 3 options, but draw most heavily from numbers 2 and 3. Which carefully planned behavioral changes, Blacks can compete and in some instances beat monopolies. The second impediment to the empowerment of Black America is just as prohibitive as the first impediment. The second impediment, inappropriate behavioral patterns. The conditions of Black America cannot be totally blamed on white society, structural monopolies. The second impediment is to empower Black America is inappropriate behavior among members of its group. The conditions of Black America cannot be totally blamed on white society, structural monopolies. The second impediment, empowering Black America, is inappropriate behavior among members of its group. Their inappropriate behavior pattern stems from twisted visions. They are conditioned to be colorblind. They neither see nor want to be Black. Blackness is not just skin color. It is more so an appropriate behavior pattern based upon a rational perspective, a perspective born out of group experiences and continued dilemmas, and erroneous perspective causes inappropriate behavior patterns. These behavioral patterns de-empower rather than empower Black people. In a society based on white superiority, it is inappropriate behavior when Black people participate in their own subordination and exploitation. It is inappropriate behavior when their actions support the established racial hierarchy and encourage dependency on white society. The more a minority group, especially a planned Black minority, the more becomes dependent. The more a minority group, especially a planned minority, becomes dependent on the majority of white society, the harder it is for the group members of the differentiate who they are and behave in their own best interest. Their dependency distorts racial reality and causes many of them to live in a stage of denial, tolerating and justifying why they are in an oppressed state. They are generally willing to accept their poor quality of life and avoid any form of competitiveness unless it's against the members of their own group. Categories of inappropriate behavior. There are many types of inappropriate behavior ranging from the class Sambo A symbol is a black person who betrays his own race and gains profit. To a militant who with an attitude blacker than thou, arrogance, inappropriate behavior is manifestation of the intentional softening of the competitive impulse in an individual or group to the point that everyone is turned upside down and backwards. The individual or group is inclined to compete among themselves and ally with outsiders rather than ally with members of their own group to compete against outsiders. What is even more troublesome is that inappropriate behavior teaches whites and others how to treat black people. If black Americans want to change how they are treated, they must change what they are teaching their competitors. Below, we will briefly discuss a few of the most common and destructive categories of an inappropriate behavior. Collusion with the competition. The type of behavior is visible in a coalition building. It is, without a doubt, the most troubling for the race because it is a strategy used by so many members of Black America's leadership class. Although coalition building is a popular concept, coalition almost always operate at the expense of Black Americans. Even though blacks themselves are not organized and do not have stated group goals, coalition building encourages them to coalesce with other groups that do not articulated goals. Rather than to organize their own group, blacks' participation gives credibility and strength to ethnic, class, gender, disabled, and Spanish-speaking groups, some of whom compete openly with blacks for wealth and power and openly oppose black gains. Which blacks participate in coalition, they allow the unique status, history, and debt owed to blacks to spread to all of the subgroups. Race is made synonymous with minority and racism and synonymous with any form of discrimination. These are gigantic distortions of reality and give fictional common ground for building coalitions between blacks and any group that perceives itself as aggrieved. Blacks should not be against any group, but what political and economical benefits do they desire from coalitions with Asians, American Indians, Hispanics, women, or gays that take black problems, convert them into minority problems, then purpose non-specific universal solutions. Political coalitions created under the broad, ambiguous concept of minority, cultural diversity, and multiculturalism do not benefit blacks as a group. In collusion with the competition, coalitions give black Americans a trickle-down political experience. They get what is left after gender, ethnic, religious, disabled, and Spanish languages groups in the coalition receive what they want and need. Black Americans lose by default due to the inappropriate behavior of black leaders who choose cross-group alliance, white approval, and corporate dollars at the expense of their own people. Social etiquette. Behavioral patterns in this category appear to stem directly from the old social and Southern racial etiquette. Though one of the major accomplishments of black civil rights movements of the 1960s was to modify some of the social etiquette that traditionally existed between blacks and whites, many blacks across America, especially the South and Mid-South, continue to honor old social customs. They avoid the situations that make them appear free, independent, and active in shaping their own lives. They are perfectly happy to go to work or to church, look at television, then go to bed. They still know their place and know how to play get low. To them, what happens to black people locally and anywhere else is the little concern. They want to appear as good Negroes, content, happy, compromising, non-competitive. A good Negro or safe black person seeks approval of whites. These black people will neither speak up nor speak all out on black issues, nor will they defend against black injustice. Avoiding blackness. Blacks who exhibit this behavior avoid association with any form of blackness. They want to be the first or only black person in an integrated company, school, neighborhood, organization, or political party. Like whites, many blacks gauge the amount of black presence, and anything that is not integrated as is all black is too black and politically incorrect. This phenomenon is peculiar to blacks. There is no particular expression that someone or something is too Jewish, too Indian, too white, or too Asian. Avoiding blackness allows many to live in a state denial until the reality roosters come home. A true story illustrates how blacks try to avoid blackness. A woman who has grown up in a conservative Midwestern town was proud of her respect and status whites accorded her family. She was proud that she and her children were economically better off than most blacks in the town, and her husband was well known in white political circles. However, her world came tumbling down one day when they came face to face. Tumbling down one day when she was in a grocery store with her daughter. When leaving the store, they came face to face with a white mother and daughter. The young white child pulled on her mother's dress and said, "Look, Mommy, there are some niggers." The white mother pulled the little girl close and whispered, "Hush, honey, those are Wilson niggers." The friend who related the story was the young black daughters. She said that for the first time in her life, she knew that regardless of her family's economic status or prominence, she was not allowed to escape her skin color. While blacks do not mind being identified with a particular sports team or political party, many reject being identified with the skin color team that God assigned them. Avoiding blackness is a counter to the way out groups respond. They exhibit an increased sense of group consciousness and close their ranks. They create association, organizations, and businesses dedicated to whatever characteristics others dislike. For instance, if Jews are persecuted because of their religion, they protest and strengthen themselves by building Jewish businesses, organizations, and tight-knit communities. They build Jewish synagogues that teach Jewish culture, history, religion. They help build and support the Jewish state of Israel. Women who feel marginalized by the system because of their gender respond by building women's organizations and businesses to promote women's issues. The gay community builds gay organizations, businesses, and tight-knit communities. Asians respond to this type of adversity by building businesses, organizations, and tight-knit communities around their Asian culture. When whites say that they despise blacks, blacks adopt that same attitude. They imitate whites and run from blackness, which should serve as a rallying point around which to build defenses. When blacks run away from themselves and avoid their own skin color, heritage, history, members of their race, they become vulnerable and defenseless. They cannot protect themselves. White ice is colder. Another category of an inappropriate behavior is the persistent belief that white ice is colder. Black America is conditioned by families, schools, and all social institutions to believe that whites are inherently superior. Although they have always been blacks who tried to disabuse other blacks to this belief, their efforts have been limited. The superior quality of white man's ice remains a commonly accepted belief of expression in Black America. I am a witness. In the mid 1970s, I actually saw a real life display of inappropriate mindset behavior, standing with a friend in front of his office building in Tallahassee, Florida. I saw a black man drive up to a black-owned grocery store. He got out of his car and walked over to the ice machine. He picked up several bags of ice, examined them, put them back into the ice machine, and then walked across the street to a white-owned liquor store. Then he went to the ice machine and took out 2 bags of ice. He examined them and went to the drive-through window to pay for them. My friend and I were so struck by the behavior that we asked him why he rejected the ice at the black store, but purchased the identical brand from the white store. He said, "I don't like Mr. Brown's ice. It's too lumpy. Jack's Liquor's ice is better." That day, I learned that not only was white ice colder, but apparently smoother to at least one black man. Inappropriate behavior has become deeply rooted in the psyche of Black America's dialectic type of reasoning. If whites touch it, make it, sell it, repair it, or talk about it, only then is it acceptable to blacks. But on even deeper level, black inappropriate behavior seems to suggest that a significant number of blacks place more value on being depreciating habits and learn inappropriate behavior patterns, beginning with offering black people new information, new political and economic goals, new social psychological models, and a new hope. The third impediment, no plan for empowerment. Through the years, blacks and whites alike have called for blacks to organize and help themselves rather than depending on whites. As early as in the 1860s, Abian W. Torgey, a visionary abolitionist, prophesied that neither the enactment of laws nor appeals of the majority society conscious would reverse the tide of white racism or lift black people. Torgey believed that the solution to the nation's race problem rested in blacks becoming more independent, exhibiting greater military and self-assertion. Torgey was so committed to these beliefs that even as a white man, he fought the conservative philosophers of Booker T. Washington, a black man. Torgey tried to convince Washington that black Americans would never gain political and economic parity in America until they organized themselves and pursued a course toward economic justice. A century later, a national committee to economic justice for blacks still has not been made. Social integration and civil rights remain the foremost issue. Black Americans need a national plan and a knowledgeable commitment leadership to guide it toward group empowerment and economic justice. PowerNomics is a national plan and requires institutional leadership to implement it. It is reverse social engineering. The sole purpose of PowerNomics is to unleash an economic and political of Black Americans by addressing the historical, structural, economic inequalities between the race and the self-defeating, inappropriate behavior patterns of Black Americans by the year of 2005. Now that the need for empowerment has been established, the remaining chapters and appendices of this book explains PowerNomics plan and how to achieve Black empowerment. That's chapter 1 of PowerNomics.